It is 10 after 10. I have already heard from Chanmi-san today that she's not able to make it today, so it's just the three of us. And I want, before I get to talking about self-disclosure, which is the topic for session 1, in the thermostat last night, I had a really helpful comment come in, and it said, could you put more on the slides, because that would help us. And I'm going to take just a minute and explain to you why I do slides the way I do, and I have already changed today's to try to make them more helpful. The way I do slides, the reason I do slides the way I do, in the United States, I teach public speaking, and a whole lot of people in the United States are very, very lazy with their slides. They put a whole lot of words on them, entire sentences on them, and then when they speak, they just read the slide. And I have a 45-minute lecture from my public speaking class about cognitive load theory and the picture superiority effect, and about how slides with lots of words on them are bad slides. But one thing that's true about communication is it always has to be specific to the audience and to the situation. I've developed the habit of making slides with lots of pictures on them for when I'm teaching native English speakers in the United States. But if I'm teaching in English to people for whom English is a second or other language, it's more important that I put words on the slides. So I'm trying to adapt, but please be patient with me because this is a habit I've had for a very long time. The one other thing, I show faces of researchers. You may have noticed that. I mention a researcher and their face comes up. That doesn't help everybody, but there are a few people, you may have met them, who never forget a face. And they've told me when I show them the face of the researcher, they remember it better. So that's another habit. Let us talk about self-disclosure. We started talking about self-disclosure yesterday when we talked about relational mobility and friendship. Because one of the reasons to come out of the research on relational mobility is Japanese people report sometimes they are careful, very, very cautious to open up and talk about themselves because a negative disclosure that made another person not like them could lose them a friend, and they're afraid they might not replace them. Now, relational mobility is very recent. We have only been studying that for maybe 10 years or so. But self-disclosure, the fact that Japanese people, when talking, reveal less about themselves, that is a research finding that goes back 50 years. It's one of the best supported and one of the first major research findings about the difference in interpersonal communication between Japanese people and Westerners. Now, I am, as I have been, going to talk through a few published studies to get into the details, what we think happens when it comes to self-disclosure. And then I'm going to talk about how self-disclosure operates in the United States in the development of relationships. And then I'm going to get to where I think the Christian influence is on this. So a 2005 study by Professor Mie Kito. She is originally from Japan, but she is in California at a university there. She recruited American participants and Japanese participants, and she just had them have a conversation task. They just had a talk. She recorded it and analyzed what they said. And she was looking for, are there differences in romantic love relationships, if they were talking to girlfriend or boyfriend, companionate love relationships, same-sex or opposite-sex friendship, in how much they would disclose about themselves. And what she found was across all of those conditions, Japanese people disclose less. They always did. She thought maybe it's different. Maybe they disclose more to their friends or more to the people they're romantically involved with, but there was no difference. Less disclosure all the way across. Professor Yuko Iwata, in a 2010 study, Professor Iwata is at Tokai University, recruited Japanese students who were studying English to have a conversation with an American native speaker, and then interviewed both the Japanese and American students after the conversation. Now, the Japanese students who were recruited had very, very high scores in English proficiency, really, really knew their English. The American native speakers said afterward that the Japanese didn't give information about themselves and that they didn't notice when the topic had changed. The pattern that happened in the conversation is the American speaker would bring something up. They would say, back home, the car that I drive a Ford Bronco. Do you have a car? Do you ever want to buy a car? And the person they were talking to would say, Broncos are very nice, but wouldn't say what car they liked, wouldn't say if they ever wanted to buy one. So the American speaker would then go on and change to another topic, trying to find a topic where this person they were talking to would say, well, here's what I think. At the end, in the interview, Professor Iwata said that the Japanese English students would say it was enjoyable to listen to the American speaker talk so much about their opinions and about their life. And the Americans would say they thought the Japanese were not friendly, that they were holding back, and that, honestly, the American student didn't want to have another conversation because it was so hard. So what Professor Iwata concluded was the changing topics was a big problem for the conversation, and also just giving less information made the conversation not run smoothly. Okay, a study a fairly long time ago, even I was young when this was published, 1977. Kiyoshi Ando, who is a professor at Todai, said that Japanese participants in conversation, they have a much higher sensitivity to rejection. And it's the fear of rejection, or what Professor Ando did was observe them and analyze in conversation how much did they disclose, and then separately had them fill out a survey that measured how afraid they were of being rejected by other people. And Professor Ando also measured several other psychological traits. We talked about some of the big 5 personality traits yesterday. Professor Ando found that what was most closely associated with whether they disclosed a lot or a little was how sensitive to rejection. If sensitivity to rejection was high, disclosure was very, very little. And the other psychological traits did not explain it as much. So that's Professor Ando's theory. It's being sensitive to rejection, and rejection seeming very much like a possibility. All right. I've blown fairly quickly through 3 studies. Professor Kito, Professor Iwata, Professor Ando. But now I'm going to get to one by this name I'm going to go ahead and put on the board if I can remember where I put the markers. I left them here last night. Oh, good. They're still here. If you want ever to study research about interpersonal communication and the differences between Japan and Americans, a professor by the name of Barnlund, Dean Barnlund, he was one of the first to publish research on that subject. And he studied this with a colleague named Akiko Asai. And this is what they did. And I'm going to go into some detail about this. They recruited Japanese and Americans, and they asked them 3 questions about these 14 topics, these disclosure topics. Previous studies had shown that these were the most sensitive disclosure topics of all. And actually, I'm going to stop talking for 2 or 3 minutes and just let you read them. So now I'll tell you what the study consisted of. There were 2 parts. First, participants were invited into an interview. So they talked one-on-one with a researcher. And the researcher asked them, for each of the 14, one at a time, tell me about your thoughts and feelings on this subject. And they would let the participant talk until they were done, and then they'd go on to the next one. And they did them in random order. And then the researcher, the whole thing was recorded, and the researcher scored the conversation, what the participant had said, this way. Do they recall thinking about this or not? Because some may say, I've never thought about that. Some participants did say, I've never thought about that. Then, how long was their answer? They would count the words. And if you had more words, a longer answer, that was data. How specific were the details as you talked about your thoughts and feelings? How detailed, well, they scored, did the participant bring up specific incidents, things that happened to them? Well, one time, I was thinking very hard about where to go to college, and that got me to thinking about my career. That would be an incident. And they scored those separately. And then finally, how consistent in logic? Did they have a very well-developed opinion that had reasoning behind it? Some did, some did not. All of that was scored from the interview. Then part 2. Each participant was asked, for each of the 14, how deeply have you thought about this subject? How often have you talked about this subject? And the third question was, how deeply have you talked with someone close to you about each of these? Now, one thing I'll point out, because this result jumped out at me. They scored which of these people were most likely to have talked about with another person. And if you see number 9, religious feeling, life after death, and it wasn't just life after death, it was the whole span of religious ideas, religious teachings. For the American participants, that was number 3. That was one of the ones they talked about a lot. And for the Japanese participants, it was number 12. It was almost at the bottom. And actually, the researchers identified that as the topic that had the sharpest difference between the 2 populations. There was no difference. This was one of their hypotheses that was not supported. There was no difference in gender, no difference between women and men overall in self-knowledge or self-disclosure. There was difference over which topics were most often talked about or less often talked about. Women spent more time talking about 2 and 3 and about 11. So attractiveness and failures, women put near the top. Men did a lot more talking about number 1, career. That was near the top. But for women, it was much further down. Other results showed Americans disclose more to their friends and disclose a lot more to their mothers. Interestingly, Barnlund and Asai found that even Americans disclose very little to their fathers. But within the family, they would disclose to their mother, and this included male participants. They would tell their mother things, but not their father. Where Barnlund and Asai wound up, they said they think what predicts self-disclosure is not rejection sensitivity. They think it's self-knowledge. You may remember we talked on the first day when we talked about self-construal, that American participants did a lot of thinking about what made them unique, and the Japanese participants in studies found that question confusing. Barnlund and Asai homed in on that, and they said that is why Americans self-disclose so much, because they think about it. They talk about it because they have strong opinions. Japanese people pay more attention to others around them, and therefore they don't reveal about themselves. They could tell you a lot about people around them. So that's a competing explanation. The one last thing that I will report out of this study, they wound up, Asai and Barnlund, they had a model of how American participants and Japanese participants, how they think about themselves and how it's divided up. And I'm going to introduce you to something that I teach to my American students and then explain how it is something that Asai and Barnlund found in their study. This is called the Johari window. And that Johari sounds like it's some strange word. There were two researchers who came up with it, and their names were Joe and Harry. So they named it the Johari window, which is kind of dumb, but we still call it that. The Johari window looks like this. And the Johari window represents what you know about yourself and what other people know about you. And it divides it and organizes it. There are some things that you know that others don't, and some things other people know that you don't. So if there's something that other people know about you that you don't know about yourself, we call that your blind self. I don't know what it is like to be a student taking a class from me, and I can never know, but you both know. So that's part of my blind self. If there are things that are true of you, but you don't know them, and neither does anyone else, we call that your unknown self. There are stories in the news sometimes that someone will have done something very, very brave and heroic and saved someone else from danger. And they'll say, I never knew I could do that. And other people will say, we never knew they could do that. But they had that potential, just nobody knew it. Then there are the things you know about yourself and others don't, and that's your private self. Yesterday I mentioned that I'm adopted. And I use that a lot as my example of something that's part of my private self. Until I tell people, I know it, but they don't. And then finally, if there's something you know and others don't, that's your public self. So the fact that I'm bald, I know that I'm bald, you know that I'm bald, that's part of my public self. And let me do one more thing before I return to the Asai and Barnlund study. When I am teaching this idea in the United States, there's an online tool that I send my students to. It is an online Johari window. Sadly, These words down here are all in English. I wish there were a Japanese version of this. But the exercise is, students from this list of words pick 5 that they think describe them. And this web page then generates a link, and they send it to family and friends and people who know them well. And those family and friends pick 5 words. And then you look and see, if you picked a word and so did all the people who know you, that's part of your public self. If you picked a word, but nobody who knows you picked it, that's part of your private self. If everybody who knows you picked a word, but you didn't pick it, that's part of your blind self. They all see that in you, but you didn't see it in yourself. And I go through all that. About 20 years ago, did this exercise, and I've invited my students to do it ever since. This is mine. So, that's a little hard to see. I'll make it bigger. I picked that I was complex, confident, happy, and intelligent. And over the years, it's not going to show it. If I hover there, it should show, because a lot of people have completed this. 59 people have done my Johari window. And, let's see, 2/3 of them picked intelligent, which is nice of them. Down here, I picked the word quiet. I think I'm a quiet person. When I'm not teaching class, I really don't start conversations. I'd rather listen to people. In 20 years and 59 students, nobody has ever picked quiet. They don't think I'm a quiet person. They only know me from teaching class. Over here, in my, come on. Why will you not? There we go. Over here in my blind spot, they said that I'm logical. They said that I'm organized. They said that I'm wise. I don't know. Those are all things they picked that I would not necessarily have picked. Okay, back we go here. And I'll take you back to the study that we were talking about, Dean Barnland and Akiko Asai. They said Americans have a much bigger private self and a much bigger public self. That they have more things that they will share. And when they share them, then they know them and the other person knows them. But they also have a bigger private self. Things they know about themselves, but that others don't know. And to real quick go back to this Johari window graphic, Asai and Barnland also said their data shows that the Japanese participants in their study have a bigger unknown self. That other people don't know because they don't disclose, but that they themselves don't know because they don't pay attention to what makes them unique. They pay attention to other people around them and to the group. All right. The final study that I want to mention, I talked about yesterday quickly, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit longer today. This study is the most recent that I've mentioned today. This was published in 2016. The researcher is Xiaojun Wang from Taiwan, from National Sun Yat-sen University. But Professor Wang was doing research on Twitter and found that Japanese people post more tweets that describe themselves than people from any other country that they've collected that data on. And so, Professor Wang recruited Japanese participants who used Twitter and gave them some surveys to fill out. And Professor Wang's hypothesis was, the more they thought they were completely anonymous, the more they thought their identity was safe and nobody knew who they were, the more they would tweet about themselves. But that was not supported. The data did not support that. Actually, and this goes back, I think, to our discussion of gift giving from yesterday. What the participants said was on Twitter, the people you communicate with, you don't have a give and take friendship with. And so finding people on Twitter who will like your tweet or respond to your tweet, you don't have any obligation to them. You don't have any duty. If they buy you a gift, you don't have to buy them a gift back because it's Twitter. They're not going to buy you a gift. And that's why it felt safe and satisfying to describe themselves on Twitter. It wouldn't get them tied up in a friendship that might give them responsibility. All right. That brings us now, I have two ideas that I teach to my students in the United States that sort of organize how self-disclosure works with Americans in how relationships develop. The first we call social penetration theory. Social penetration theory. And my students always wind up loving this one because it's so simple. There are two ways to organize disclosures. A disclosure disclosure activity can be broad or it can be narrow. Broad or narrow. That's one way to organize. The other one is it could be shallow or deep. Shallow or deep. Now let me explain broad or narrow very quickly. If Mari-san and I were to talk about music, and I were to say, here's one of my favorite songs and what I like about it. Here's another one of my favorite songs and what I like. And Mari said, well, here's one of my favorite songs and what I like about it. And we just talked about our favorite songs. That's narrow self-disclosure. Broad self-disclosure would be, here's my favorite song, here's my favorite movie, here's my favorite food, here's my favorite place to travel to, disclosing in a lot of different subject areas. That's broad. And it's funny. When I came here, they warned me. I said, well, I'm going to ask my students, what's your favorite restaurant? What should I be sure to go to in the area? And people said, they won't tell you. They won't tell you. Because they'll say, well, a lot of them are good. Well, it depends on what you like. Because there was a worry that if they mention something and you don't like it, there might be a loss of harmony. So I was warned from the beginning, that kind of disclosure you may not get. And that's kind of what the data says will happen. Okay, shallow versus deep is also easy. It's shallow if you would tell it to absolutely anybody. Any information you would give to absolutely anybody is shallow disclosure. For example, I'll pause while you write. Right before we started, I was curious what is written on Fabi-san's sleeve, on the hoodie.
Perfect pasta on every fork.
Perfect pasta on every fork. Now, I know you're willing to disclose that. It's on your clothing. So, that's shallow disclosure. Let's see. Where did you buy that mask you have on your face? Okay, that's slightly less shallow because the first one was written on your clothing. I don't even have to ask. But then, you were willing to tell me where you bought the mask, right? We could go, though, deeper and deeper. Any information that, okay, I'll tell you because we're in this class, I've known you for 2 days, I know you that well. Oh, that's starting to get private. As we go further into things you don't tell, those disclosures are deeper. So shallow disclosures, anybody can know. Deeper disclosures, not just anybody. Social penetration theory says, it's real simple. When people first meet, there's lots and lots of disclosure, but it's almost all shallow. And it's very fast, and it tends to be very broad. You disclose on a whole lot of topics, because the more you talk about innocent things that it's okay for anybody to know about you, the more you and the other person feel like you're not strangers anymore. I know things about this person. I know that Fabi-san likes a restaurant called Garfield's that puts perfect pasta on every fork. That's something I know about you. As you get closer, as a friendship develops, what usually happens is disclosure slows down. It's not as fast, but it also goes deeper. Little by little, you start to reveal things. I can give you an example that's a safe example because neither of you have done this. But I often have to tell students of mine, we will get down to where class is almost over and they notice it, and they'll gather their books up and they'll put them into their backpack and zip it up. And I have to tell them, I hate it when people do that. Every professor I've known hates it when people do that, and it's actually very rude. Because everyone around you can see and hear you doing it, and then they stop paying attention and they think it's time to leave. Now, I wouldn't tell a student that the first time I met them. They would think, oh, he doesn't like me already. But if I've known them a little bit, known them for a few days, and I'm not a stranger to them, then I can share that with them. And I can say, you know, that bothers me and I don't like it. And that's a slightly deeper self-disclosure. Social penetration theory says, as relationships get stronger and stronger and closer, you disclose more and more deeply. Now, we talked on the first day about the weird problem. And we've been talking about relational mobility and differences in friendship between the United States or the West and Japan. I don't think social penetration theory would hold up well if all the participants were Japanese. Because the idea that as the friendship got stronger, there was deeper and deeper disclosure, the data does not seem to support that. It seems to be in Japan, strong friendships are friendships that have lasted a long time. I've known this person a long time, they are therefore my friend. I have known them since I was younger, they are therefore my friend. I don't think that the study has been done yet. I think it would be interesting if someone did it to test social penetration theory in Japan. But that's a way to explain how disclosure operates in the United States. The other one that I want to bring up, let's see. Yeah, we're doing fine on time. Privacy management theory. This is another one of the theories that my students wind up really, really liking because it's also really pretty simple. This is the work of a researcher that years ago I knew. Her office was right down the hall from mine. Her name is Sandra Petronio, and I can give you, if you're interested in this, I can give you her name and the spelling of it and all. But it's about if someone else finds out information about you that's private, that you don't tell anybody, how do people talk to each other about how to keep one another's secrets? She says, in the United States, we treat private information almost like it's property. almost like it's a house. And a house always has somebody who owns it and other people who are guests. So the person who the information is about, I'll give you a simple one right now, a silly one as an example. I have double-jointed thumbs. That's private because it makes me a freak, but you now know. So I'm the owner of that information because the information is about me. And her theory says the one who is the owner of the information has a right to set rules. Now, don't tell Chanmi-san when she comes back, although it's on the recording, don't tell Chanmi-san about my double-jointed thumbs. Her theory lays out that sometimes someone else might be, and this is a good word for me to put on the board, what she calls a stakeholder. That is a term, an English term from business law. Companies will sometimes sell stock, and you could buy so much stock that you have a right to be included on the decisions the company makes. And if you buy that much stock, you're a stakeholder. So, for example, let us imagine there's a married couple, and one of the married couple, let's say the husband, a test comes back and he has a sexually transmitted disease. Well, in some sense, that's his private information. But his wife is a stakeholder. She has a right to be in on the decision of who finds out and who doesn't. Because just that fact affects her a lot. So what actually two more things to say about that. The owner of the information, so me and my double-jointed thumbs, often draws a boundary. So I might say, it's okay for you to tell other students about my thumbs, but don't tell any professors, and that's a boundary. But sometimes boundaries aren't clear. I might say, it's okay for you to tell students, and I might mean, well, I only mean Gaidai students. And you might tell someone at Tsuda or ICU or Todai, and I might get upset. And you might say, well, you said students. The person I told is a Todai student. And I say, but I thought you knew. When I said students, I meant students here. So what the whole theory says is, it's important when other people have your private information that you be pretty clear about what you expect. And sometimes your private information might affect them so much, they might have a right to help you decide who gets to know it and who doesn't. Those are the two, social penetration theory and privacy management theory, are the two major works in the communication field about how disclosure works in relationships. And so I finally, as I have been doing all along, want to share with you a little bit of how I think this is influenced by Christian teaching and the Bible. I mentioned yesterday the first several chapters of the Bible about the creation of everything and the first man and the first woman. And in that story, they talk about the first time they broke God's law, the first time they committed a sin. God had told them there was a tree in the garden where they lived. God said, don't eat the fruit from that tree. And they did eat it. And what I want to play for you right now, and I realize I don't have this queued up, but oh, wait a minute, maybe I do. Yeah, this won't be hard. This is from, and it's from the end of one chapter to the beginning of another, so you're going to have to be patient while I get from one chapter to the other. Then I'll tell you what this meant. Boom.
人とその妻は二人とも裸であったが、恥ずかしいとは思わなかった。
All right. And then to the next chapter.
第3章。さて、ヘリは神である主が作られた野の生き物のうちで、他のどれよりも賢かった。ヘリは女に言った。園の木のどれからも食べてはならないと、神は本当に言われたのですか。女はヘリに言った。
私たちは園の木の実を食べてもよいのです。しかし、園の中央にある木の実については、あなた方はそれを食べてはならない。それに触れてもいけない。あなた方が死ぬといけないからだ。と、神は仰せられました。
すると、ヘリは女に言った。あなた方は決して死にません。それを食べるその時、目が開かれて、あなた方が神のようになって、善悪を知るものとなることを神は知っているのです。そこで女が見ると、その木は食べるのに良さそうで、目にしたわしく、またその木は賢くしてくれそうで好ましかった。それで、女はその実を取って食べ、共にいた夫にも与えたので、夫も食べた。こうして、二人の目は開かれ、自分たちが裸であることを知った。そこで彼らは、イチジクの葉をつづり合わせて、自分たちのために腰の覆いを作った。そよ風の吹く頃、彼らは、神である主が、園を歩き回られることを聞いた。それで人とその妻は、神である主の御顔を避けて、園の木の間に身を隠した。神である主は人に呼びかけ、彼に言われた。あなたはどこにいるのか。彼は言った。私はあなたの足音を園の中で聞いたので、自分が裸であるのを恐れて、身を隠しています。
Okay, so what just happened there? The serpent tempted the man and the woman, and they ate the fruit. Well, the first verse we looked at before we switched chapters, they were naked, they weren't ashamed. They had absolutely nothing to hide. Before they ate the fruit, they had never, ever disobeyed God. They had nothing to be ashamed of. They had nothing that they had to hide. The first thing that happened after they ate the fruit, they were ashamed that they'd eaten the fruit. And the Bible says, for the first time, they realized they were naked and they ran and hid. Now, a little bit further in this chapter, God will make clothes for them, and they can cover themselves. But one of the things that is a major theme in Christian teaching is that what we need to do is take what we're ashamed of and confess it. First of all, we confess it by praying. And we talked the first day about you can pray out loud or you can pray silently in your head. And where we've talked before about repenting. Part of repenting is admitting to yourself and admitting to God, there are things I've done that are wrong. There are things that don't meet your standard of perfection. I've broken what your will is for me. But then after that, and it's crossing my mind because Fabio-san is sitting right here. In the Roman Catholic Church, one of the sacraments, a regular practice of practicing Catholics, is go to a priest and tell the priest your sins, and the priest will tell you that you're forgiven and might give you some things you have to do as discipline for having sinned. Some Christian groups do it. Other Christian groups don't do it. My group says you work all of that out in prayer directly with God. So some do it, some don't. But what does happen with just about all groups of Christians, there is what the Bible teaches us we should do is we should tell one another how God has been at work in our lives. We use the same word we use for the witnesses in a trial who will say, this person came and robbed a bank. This person came and broke into my house. They testify. And so, the Bible teaches we ought to testify, tell the story of how God is working in our life. Now, when you testify about how God is working, often the first part of that is to say, I was doing really horrible, shameful things. Let's say I was married, which I'm not. I was cheating on my wife. I was going to prostitutes. I was using pornography. I was doing all these awful things. And God was merciful to me, and God showed me that's the wrong way, and I stopped, and I don't do that anymore. And they'll tell that to other members of their church, to everybody, in public. And I have found it interesting because I teach at a Christian university. I'll teach social penetration theory that at first you share surface things and you do it rapidly, and then as you get to know people, you slow way down and you start to disclose deeper things. And I always ask my students, you've heard your fellow Christians give their testimony. That's a pretty deep disclosure, isn't it? And then I say, and they do it the first time they meet you. They don't wait until they know you. And it's common. And people who grow up going to church have heard a lot of people tell the most shameful, embarrassing thing that's ever happened to them on first meeting. So, that idea, Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman, they knew they were naked and had to cover themselves the first time they disobeyed God. And if they had never disobeyed God, they would have had nothing to hide. And all of these people I have known in my life who were Christians would take things they ordinarily would hide and publicly tell them as part of their faith, to say, God has forgiven me for this. God has worked in my life to help me overcome this. And because God forgives me, I'm no longer ashamed of it. So that, I think you can say, is the Christian influence on why, in the United States, self-disclosure is a lot freer and more open. And if you were to go digging around in the communication journals, you would find some references, a lot of references, to confession culture. That in the West, going back about 40 years, more and more things that used to be considered private are now talked about openly. There's a lot of talk now about mental health and people talking about mental health struggles. And that's great, and it's healthy, and it lets people support each other. But you go back to my parents' time, your grandparents' time, you never talked about that. Oh, that was undignified. But the progress we've made toward talking openly, it's really started to speed up. And then on online platforms with YouTube videos and blogs, people tell everything. So that is where I'm going to pause our discussion, and I'm going to hit the recorder. That is where I'm going to go away for 10 minutes. So I'm going to go away for 10 minutes, and we're going to have 2 questions instead of 3.